Oh, goodness, I hope not. Isn't the world a complicated enough place? Unfortunately, it's certainly possible.
From Seoul, South Korea, you're listening to Asian News Weekly. The United Nations votes on North Korea. Does the failure of ASEAN mean more trouble in the South China Sea and Japan's snap election? These stories and more are on the November 21st edition of Asian News Weekly. Hello everyone, welcome to this week's podcast. I'm your host, Steve Miller, and I'd like to thank you for listening and downloading this week's show. I really do appreciate it. And so let's go ahead and get started with the week's news. A UN report submitted earlier this year on the human rights atrocities in North Korea detailed wide-ranging abuses, including prison camps, systematic torture, starvation, and killings comparable to Nazi-era atrocities. A draft resolution was prepared for the Third Committee by the European Union and Japan, urging that the General Assembly send the regime to the International Criminal Court in The Hague to stand trials for crimes against humanity. On our November 5th Asia Now podcast, I spoke with Joanna Hosniak, Deputy Director General of the Citizens Alliance for North Korean Human Rights, about her involvement in generating the report. If you haven't heard that interview, you can find it on our website and a link will be provided in the show notes. In New York on Tuesday, that third committee held their vote and its decision was definitive. Joanna now joins me via Skype to discuss the vote, but be aware our connection wasn't the best, so please pardon the technical difficulties. Joanna, welcome back to the podcast.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here again.
So let's talk about the vote that was in the third committee this week. The vote for the resolution measured 111 for, 19 against, 55 in abstention. And of course, it was widely suspected that this measure would pass. But I wanted to ask you, did any of the votes that took place, that were cast, surprise you?
In the civil society community, we expected that the resolution would pass. However, there was a nervous atmosphere until the last moment. We conducted lobbying activities, sent out letters both in New York and here in Seoul to all of the embassies, especially those that abstained or voted no, or those who recently switched to yes. We asked them for continued support, despite the fact that the resolution has this paragraph on encouraging Security Council to pick up this issue and hold North Korea accountable for its crimes against humanity and possible referral to ICC. That was a very strong measure in this resolution, and we were worried still, given the recent North Korea charms offensive and the strong lobbying, especially in New York, that there will be many countries that will actually switch to no or switch to abstentions. However, it didn't happen. It was a great success with 111 votes yes and very obvious votes no, only 19 of them. So it's a great day for NGOs who worked on that, like ours, and for many victims who also were advocates.
Well, yeah, I mean, we all expected anywhere between 100 and 120 yes votes, but I think what really caught my eye was the 55 abstention votes. And I wanted to ask you, why would a country abstain? Is there anything to gain by it?
Usually these countries, have some political or economic ties to North Korea, and that's why they are abstaining for political reasons. So countries like Indonesia, for example, where there is a big community, North Korean community, they do business there. There are many workers. Some countries in Africa that sell certain resources to North Korea and have some bilateral trade ties with North Korea. North Korea also did visit some of these countries, African countries, especially recently, not only to promote the economic ties with them, but to really ask them to switch to no. It happened, for example, with Uganda, Tanzania, and other countries, but Uganda didn't switch to no. It continued with abstention. But this is the reason why many of these countries abstain.
Let me ask you about some of these other countries, especially Cuba and especially like Iran and some of the other countries. They said that the resolution unfairly targeted North Korea, and Cuba even tried unsuccessfully to amend the measure in what some have viewed as protecting Kim Jong-un as being held accountable for the crimes against humanity. Is that criticism valid, or is it just overreaching?
The resolution that passed is not only a critical resolution toward North Korea. It doesn't have only accountability measures on the table. There are also issues of engagement, of continued engagement. That was always like that. It's just some of these countries are using it as a political tool to kind of discard this resolution and say that, this is unfair. It only, targets North Korea in terms of criminal justice. That is not true. From the beginning, the EU-Japan resolution, there were two tracks in that resolution. One was criticizing North Korea, at the same time recognizing North Korea, some of the efforts that they made, and also encouraging them to, engage with the UN more. So this two-track approach has been continued and has been even strengthened with this resolution, and especially with North Korea, proposition that they will cooperate more strongly with UN, inviting the special rapporteur, and probably maybe allowing for the technical cooperation in the future with UN. So these measures of engagement were also strengthened in this resolution. But some countries want very much, especially those that are, in the back. It's really China's work, China's support of North Korea, and China is really asking many countries to come up with those measures, like this counter resolution of Cuba. It is not that Cuba come out with it by itself. It's normally that China, asks these countries. China doesn't want to do that itself, but it asks other countries to do this kind of measure to defend North Korea. But it's all motivated politically.
Okay, so of course it's past the third committee. It has to go before the General Assembly next, yes. And ultimately it'll then probably go to the Security Council. And if it does go there, it's widely suspected that China is going to use its veto power. So if it's going to come to that, why go through all these behind-the-scenes measures to try and change things up front?
Well, first of all, this is a very strong message. It doesn't happen with any country that international community so widely supports a measure against the country to refer the country to International Criminal Court for crimes. So this will be an issue that will be lingering for a very long time, and North Korea has to deal with that image right now. It will be very problematic for North Korea. So this has been done. And secondly, the fact that international community supports that, it doesn't mean that, if Security Council, if China vetoes it, which it will, that, the issue will go away. It won't. Anytime when something happens in North Korea, the international community can set up a court or refer the country to International Criminal Court. And anyway, these criminals will be held accountable sooner or later. This is the fact, and the fact that international community so strongly supports these measures, it just shows that we have a room for different strategies as well in the future, that simply this room is opened. And of course the ICC referral is not the only strategy that can be used at the council. Simply there are also other possibilities, a linkage between human rights and security. So for example, something like targeted sanctions against the leadership, not economic sanction, but against the leadership, the sanctions on the personal accounts and so on. It could be also potentially used, and probably it would be also less problematic for China. So there are many avenues that NGOs will probably pursue further after, even if the resolution at the Security Council is blocked.
I want to ask you one last question. North Korea is spending a lot of time, as we've talked about over the past few weeks, on a charm offensive, and now they're really hitting up Russia. Do you think they're trying to do that in an attempt to get a second veto vote on the Security Council?
Of course, that's Russia fell out of international favor, right? It's like
right.
because of what they are doing in Ukraine. So North Korea sees it as an opportunity. They are outcasts now, so they are seeing Russia as an opportunity to approach and to create another ally. Normally, there are certain differences between China and Russia. Sometimes it happens that when China votes yes, China vetoes and so on certain issues. So right now they are looking for like strong movement against that, and just Russia is an obvious ally for them to kind of approach. But even without Russia, the resolution would probably be vetoed by China. China already said that. So this is just a kind of, a cosmetic change.
Joanna Hosniak is Deputy Director General of the Citizens Alliance for North Korea Human Rights. Thank you so much for joining me this week.
Thank you for having me again.
As we mentioned, it's widely expected that China and/or Russia will utilize their veto power to kill the measure in the Security Council. However, there is no certainty that will occur. So my question to you is this: do you think China will or won't protect the DPRK? Please leave your response in the comments on Facebook or tweet them to me at Steve Miller ANW on Twitter. Why haven't China and the ASEAN members finalized the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea? Rand Corporation's Scott Harold shares his insights later in the podcast. Leaders around the world have completed their series of high-profile meetings. It started with the APEC Summit, transitioned to the ASEAN Summit, then the East Asia Summit, and just recently, the G20 meeting in Australia. As expected, there were a number of economic deals announced as these leaders met. We saw discussions on economic growth, including a challenge by Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott, who has challenged G20 members to come up with a definite plan to help add $2 trillion to the world's GDP in hopes of creating jobs and encouraging more free trade. Stepping up to the plate to help meet that challenge was South Korea and New Zealand, who announced a new free trade deal that would see New Zealand abolishing tariffs on over 7,200 South Korean goods over the next 7 years. And Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said he wanted deeper defense ties with both the United States and Australia, outlining his vision by saying, quote, "As the United States is the most important ally for Japan and Australia, I am determined to expand trilateral cooperation between the three countries to realize a peaceful, secure, and prosperous future for the Asia-Pacific region. I also hope our countries will work closely together to support the resolution of global issues." End quote. It, in some ways, makes more sense to do these activities here. However, the G20 also did something else. It put the spotlight on Russia and how it was handling Ukraine. President Obama had these words for Putin.
My communications to him was no different than what I've said publicly, as well as what I've said to him privately over the course of this crisis in Ukraine. And that is, Russia has the opportunity to take a different path.
And of course, these were words, not actions. Sure, there have been condemnations and sanctions, but that's where it ends. Which brings me to this point. What about China? It's been said time and time again, China is watching Europe. How the world responds to the armed incursion into Ukraine by Russia will have direct relevance to how the world will respond to China expanding its influence in the East and South China Seas. Right now, as with Russia, world leaders are simply talking to China about its activity. The words haven't brought about any change and truthfully show countries really aren't willing to step in and help out weaker nations as they might have done half a century ago. The fear that someone might get hurt just isn't worth the political risk. In both cases, Russia and China, talking about the situation doesn't bring about a resolution. It has the opposite effect, in strengthening both Moscow and Beijing's position, because they face no real consequences, and that's what needs to change. And I want to hear from you. Do you agree or disagree with me? I welcome your thoughts and hope you'll share them with me. South Korea's President Park Geun-hye has proposed trilateral talks with China and Japan, but will they happen? That story is coming up in just a few minutes. For this next story, we need to dial back the hands of time just a little bit. Before the G20 summit in Australia or even the East Asia summit in Myanmar, there was the ASEAN summit. It was hoped that at this meeting, leaders would finally come together and approve a binding code of conduct for behavior in this highly contested South China Sea. Philippine President Aquino openly challenged China to take, quote, concrete action to that end, saying that as a partner of ASEAN, China had to demonstrate to the rest of the world that it can jointly with the Southeast Asian bloc deal with security concerns in the region based on the rule of law. Chinese Premier Li Keqiang responded by saying China's resolve to safeguard territorial sovereignty is clear, and its determination to uphold regional peace and stability is firm. So, what is this code of conduct? What's the hiccup? And where do we go from here? To get those answers, returning to the podcast is Scott Harold, political scientist with the RAND Corporation.
Well, what it is, I think, first, to the extent that it's available online, you can already tell what it is, what's been proposed. I think the declaration of the parties to the Code of Conduct was released in, I think, 2002, which is hence the 12-year comment. I think the reason that they don't want to, or the reason that it hasn't been formally agreed upon is the Chinese side tends to regard the South China Sea as a bilateral issue only and has not wanted to multilateralize it, including to negotiate with all of ASEAN. And frankly, there's a lot of countries in ASEAN that are happy to sign up to a code of conduct but don't necessarily want to have to do so to force Beijing into doing so because they don't really have much of a dog in this fight. You can think of Laos or even Cambodia. I mean, they're not really claimant states in the South China Sea. They're heavily dependent on Chinese largesse, and they really oftentimes are at odds with other countries that are claimant states, for example, Cambodia often being in a position of having difficult relations with Vietnam at the popular level, although its central government is also in many ways dependent upon good relations with Hanoi. So I think that's part of an answer.
And certainly plausible. Let me ask you this. Because the Code of Conduct is based on standing international law, why is there a need for this new document?
Well, I think the Code of Conduct is largely a symbolic commitment on the part of the actors who are involved in the South China Sea, primarily ASEAN and China, to agree that they're going to publicly commit to resolving their differences in a way that is predictable, peaceful, and cooperative. Now, that's the idea, at least. Unfortunately, as we've seen, even after the signing of the non-binding statement of the Declaration of the Parties on the Code of Conduct in 2002, which makes it pretty clear that countries that observe and detect poaching of protected maritime and marine wildlife, all of them agree that they all have the right to suppress illegal poaching anywhere it's occurring. Even in spite of that, when the Filipinos found Chinese fishermen poaching sharks and the endangered coral and sea turtles in Scarborough Shoal in 2012, instead of simply saying, well, we certainly don't want to condone lawlessness and illegal maritime poaching, but we also don't regard the Philippines as having a legal claim to Scarborough Shoal or Huangyan Reef, as the Chinese refer to it. So without prejudicing our claim, we are going to support the Philippines' right to suppress poaching while at the same time reserving our right to make this claim. Instead, they simply said, well, we're going to blow this up into a big international issue. So loss of face for China. How dare the Filipinos seek to enforce this legal issue using a maritime vessel? Bear in mind the Philippines has almost no maritime capacity, so if they'd taken the one vessel that was in the area and driven it back to replace it with a Coast Guard vessel or law enforcement vessel, the illegal fishermen would have been gone by that point. So the Chinese essentially created a diplomatic crisis where there wasn't one. So I think, the basic, well, my long-winded answer is, I think it's largely diplomatic and political, not, you're right. There's no need to reinvent the international rule of law wheel, but there's some suspicion that certain actors may not want to abide by that, and so let's try and get them to sign on the dotted line and say, hey, commit yourself to cooperatively resolving this issue.
Do you think that getting everyone to actually sign on a binding resolution is going to happen? I mean, we've talked about it. It's been on the book since 2002, and one of the provisions is that you won't develop in undeveloped areas. But we see China going into the Spratlys and reclaiming land, trying to exert their claim in that area. Does that say something about everyone's commitment to moving it forward?
I think that, first, the notion that any of these things would be binding is a little bit challenging, right? Because, even international law is usually very hard to enforce unless you have an actor who's willing to step up and pay the costs to impose it on others. It's very, very difficult. But with that said, I would say that I don't think the Chinese are the only ones. All of the, or many of the countries in and around the South China Sea or the East Sea if you're from Vietnam, or the West Philippine Sea if you're from the Philippines, many of those countries have been building up structures on reefs, engaging in fishing in waters that other countries regard as potentially theirs, occupying structures, improving structures, letting out blocks for development and exploration that are regarded as contested. One of the big complaints from the Chinese side is, well, the Vietnamese have invited some time ago ExxonMobil or Oil and Natural Gas Corporation of India to explore for blocks that China regards as falling within its own area. So it would be hard to say that any of these countries doesn't have dirt on your hands when it's talking about water. But at any rate, they're all trying to lay down a marker because they all believe this is mine, and if I don't do it and I wait to be the second person to act, that there are some significant first mover advantages. If you occupy a reef, then it's up to the other guy to push you off of it. Otherwise, possession is 9/10. So in that sense, I think they've all had a hard time avoiding the pressure to move first, and then that may be one of the reasons why the declaration was valuable, and why a code of conduct would be valuable. It again lays down a political marker, a diplomatic marker, and in some sense it imposes a reputational cost on those who sign up to it. They say, in essence, although international law governs this already, but I want to reinforce that not only is there a way to handle this, but also there's a way to avoid getting into a crisis, and that is I won't do something if you agree not to do something that we both will be worse off if we each try to do it first.
One last question. Now that we've come to a conclusion of all these major summits, the ASEAN, the East Asian Summit, APEC, and coming up to the end of the G20, do you think that we will see more rhetoric and more possible clashes as we move into 2015?
Oh, goodness, I hope not. Isn't the world a complicated enough place? Unfortunately, it's certainly possible. I would say that coming out of the APEC summit, and frankly, out of the, all the way through to the G20, China has taken an awful lot of steps that get it some pretty good publicity. Okay, I'm sure Xi Jinping didn't like it, but he shook hands with Prime Minister Abe. There was obviously the agreement with the U.S. to publicize a joint set of aspirations on the control of climate change-inducing greenhouse gas emissions. There was the 10-year deal on visas. There was a deal on liberalizing trade in high-tech goods, and there's some new mill aspects. So I think there's an awful lot of positive momentum for China right now, and then they went and signed a couple of bilateral FTA agreements, one with South Korea and one with Australia. So I think that for now, China is in a position where it's a relatively unusual situation lately for China. They have a lot of pretty goodwill coming out of its most recent set of activities. I think the real question will be, can they build on that? Can they continue that streak? It's not clear yet, at least not to me, whether this is driven primarily by the fact that they were hosting and then attending these large meetings and looking to perhaps add a bit of pep to their economy, which is slowing rather rapidly, or if this is part of a longer-term turn away from that assertive posture that we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years and towards a bit greater effort to rebuild their political and diplomatic capital with their neighbors. I think certainly the entire region, as well as major world actors, would like to see China return to a somewhat more cooperative, less Rousseau-inspired, if you will, approach to foreign and security policy, i.e. don't take after what Putin's doing, but it'll remain to be seen. I mean, coming up in 2015, we will have the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II. I'm fairly certain that will remind people in China and be used to remind people in China of bad times in the past with their Japanese neighbor, and that might be a rather complicating factor for remaining on very positive terms with Tokyo over the next 12 months, but remains to be seen.
So you heard from Scott, but now I would like to hear from you. What are your predictions about the South China Sea in the coming months? Why did Shinzo Abe decide to hold a snap election? Well, you'll be able to get the skinny after updates from Hong Kong. President Park Geun-hye has proposed a trilateral summit between South Korea, Japan, and China. When news first broke about this meeting last week, some thought that she was proposing a sit-down between Chinese President Xi Jinping, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, and herself. And truthfully, that is not the case. What she is proposing is that the foreign ministers of these three nations meet, and preferably do so before the end of the year. Unfortunately, lingering resentment towards Japan's actions that led up to World War II and its current take on history since then have prevented the leaders of East Asia's economic and political powerhouses from meeting. Quote, "The key to the talks isn't held by China or South Korea. It's Japan. There's no reason to have a summit if we can't make progress because Japan isn't showing good faith on historical issues," said Geun-hye, professor at the Center for Korean Studies at China's Fudan University. That's the precise point of view that President Park has. It plays out extremely well at home, scoring massive political points with nationalists, but comes off differently on the international stage. President Park is also running into problems convincing China that a meeting is worthwhile. Geun-hye continues, "Beijing has definitely shown a lot of goodwill to Seoul this year, including the FTA, but Seoul's attitude to Beijing has been hot on economics, lukewarm politically, and cold on security. People feel that President Xi got a very cold reception when he went to South Korea in July." The truth is that after nearly 3 years, the time has come for these three leaders to put aside past differences, meet, and get things settled, especially when it comes to North Korea. That the leaders can't stand to be in the same room speaks volume as to how great a problem this is. Don't believe me? Take a look at the pictures when these leaders met. They all look as if they have all better things to do. A meeting needs to happen, but the chances that will are less than slim at best. A very telling reason actually doesn't come from any politician, academic, or think tank, but from a comment on an old podcast, and I do mean old. It was from an episode that dropped nearly 2 years ago. It was from a user named Veritas, who wrote this with respect to South Korea-Japan relations. "The Japanese have done so many wrong things to its neighbors during the past centuries. The Japanese army and its soldiers have committed countless atrocities during the colonization of Korea. Plus, there were the terrible chemical weapons experiments conducted on men, women, and children in Manchuria by the notorious Unit 731. Which, as you might recall from last week's podcast, that site is now serving as a museum to preserve the history of those atrocities. Veritas then continues to leave a number of other crimes against South Korea by Japanese imperial forces, complete with links to support those claims. It's the same visceral response I get on the other side of the coin, when Japanese members from the Japanese right wing discuss history. For example, In our Asia Now podcast, it was asked, if the emperor chooses not to visit the Yasukuni shrine, why do lawmakers? The responses begin with correlations of Arlington National Cemetery and the fact that other heads of state have visited Yasukuni Shrine. The responses begin with correlations of Arlington National Cemetery. And this week, a picture was also tweeted to me showing U.S. naval personnel. However, the actual question and issue were never addressed. The introspection simply does not take place. Unfortunately, both sides do fall short on rectifying this situation, and we see that with the current state of relations between both South Korea and Japan. South Korea is waiting for an apology from Japan, and frankly, it's one that isn't going to come. But more importantly, it's also one they haven't asked for. It's true, South Korea refuses to come out clearly and state what and how they want Japan to apologize. Instead, South Korea continues to use language like they want Japan to reflect on their past or to stop revising history. It is a very diplomatic way of stating things, but one that's been ineffective in producing dialogue. What it is effective in doing is perpetuating the political tactic of denouncing Japan to score points in polls, and as much as South Korea would like to think otherwise, it also sustains an image of victimization and pettiness. The world looks at these bilateral relations and simply says, "It's been 70 years. Get over it." Japan isn't off the hook either. China and South Korea, as I have mentioned, like to bring up Japan's whitewashing of history or failure to apologize. Japan supporters also bring up various bits of information to attack the credibility of claims or state that the nation has apologized many times, so there's no need to do so again. Well, if one says, "I'm sorry, but I didn't do anything wrong," is that really an apology? That's precisely the perception by both South Korea and China. That's why these two nations still aren't satisfied with Japan's statements. We see this especially with regard to the comfort women, where if one piece of evidence comes into question, it means the entire claim is invalid, or we see comments like the women were prostitutes and were paid for their work. However, the state of their human rights or the violations they suffered are never discussed. And I'm not the only one who sees this or has commented on this behavior. There was a great opinion piece in the New York Times this week on just that very subject, and you'll be able to find that link in the show notes. No side is innocent, and no side is really making any sincere strides to try and rectify this situation. Continued fixation on Japan's historical views does absolutely nothing to address the real-world problems that exist in the present. So I want to ask you, can a trilateral meeting between the three foreign ministers be fruitful and ultimately lead to the much-needed top-level summit? Please share your opinion in the comments on Facebook or Twitter. Don't miss our Asia Now podcast. It's released every Wednesday and features stories and interviews from the Asia-Pacific region. This week on the podcast, I spoke to a longtime American expat who's currently living in Japan. He went over there for a single year to teach English and has now made it his career. If you know of someone who wants to come to Asia to teach or is looking to go to Japan to teach English, this is a great conversation to listen in on. I mentioned it in last week's podcast, and now it's coming to fruition. Authorities in Hong Kong have begun clearing the streets. The High Court bailiffs, backed by police, dismantled barricades outside the Civic Tower after the building's owners complained about blockages and were granted an injunction. Student protesters did not resist and actually, in some cases, assisted in the removal of tents and barricades. It was the ultimate example of protesting the government while adhering to the rule of law. For since the beginning of the Occupy movement, leaders have remained adamant that respect for personal property be upheld. As the barricades and tents were removed from adjoined areas, the pro-democracy protesters said that they would move on to other public areas and continue their demonstrations. Student leader Joshua Wong said that they would not resist as long as authorities only cleared the areas mentioned in the injunction. Mr. Wong also said that if authorities headed to other sites, activists would be very disappointed. This was the situation as it best could be displayed. But not everything went as smoothly. Reports have surfaced that a small group of protesters illegally entered the city's legislative office building early Wednesday morning. Roughly 100 police officers outfitted in complete riot gear rushed onto the scene. When other protesters tried to smash their way in, things escalated, and police reverted to the use of batons and pepper spray in an attempt to quell the crowd. Fernando Chung, a Democratic lawmaker at the scene, said that he and other protesters had tried to stop the small group of radical activists from breaking through. Quote, "This is a very, very isolated incident. I think it's very unfortunate, and this is something we don't want to see happen because the movement so far has been very peaceful." End quote. After the scuffle, reports indicate that either 4 or 6 of the protesters were arrested and 3 police officers were injured. The pro-democracy movement, now over 2 months old, has been at an impasse for some time. There needs to be some traction to remove the stalemate, and as I've said repeatedly, waiting in the streets isn't going to change Beijing's mind. In fact, dragging out the protests and clogging the streets is slowly turning the tide against the pro-democracy advocates as businesses continue to suffer. According to a poll conducted by the Chinese University of Hong Kong, 67.4% of the people surveyed said that the activists should give up their street occupation immediately. It's not a number that should be shied away from, and it's exactly what Beijing wants. If the students and Occupy leaders want democracy, they need to bring something to the table. What they're doing now is slowly wasting away any chance they have for success. Do you agree with me? What do you think the protesters' next move will be? And will the Occupy leaders turn themselves in, as was reported last week? Let me know. Things aren't going well for Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. While he did manage to get that long sought-after face-to-face meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping at the APEC summit, that meeting is often described as chilly, with a clear look of disinterest on the Chinese leader's face. Believe it or not, that's probably the best news for Abe. Economists have confirmed this week that Japan's economy, the world's 3rd largest, has slid into recession. It's a clear indication that Abe's economic stimulus plan hasn't worked. Furthermore, the second phase of a planned tax increase that was set to go into effect next year has been put off, if not abandoned, due to low public support. Now the Prime Minister is looking to hold a snap election, 2 years ahead of schedule, to try and shore up support for his administration and policies. What exactly is he hoping to achieve? Michael Chuchek, adjunct fellow at the Institute for Contemporary Asian Studies at Temple University, Japan, had this to say.
It gives him 4 years rather than 2 years to complete his revolution, both in economics and in Japan's security policies, and a little bit also in its domestic, particularly its education policies. But just going to the voters and saying, I need more time, I want more time, is probably not something that will be very attractive as a message. So he's packaging it in a more attractive way, saying that I'm really asking your opinion about my job so far.
That's only a portion of the conversation, and you'll be able to hear the entire discussion this upcoming Wednesday, November 26th, on the Asia Now podcast. If you're listening from Japan, I would love to hear what you think the Prime Minister is trying to do. Well, my friends, we have come to the end of the podcast, but before I go, I would like to highlight a couple of the comments that came in this past week. And first up is one from Zachary Downey. Now, he wrote this comment in response to the Milken Institute's Curtis S. Chin's final thoughts on whether or not the U.S. Congress could possibly push through the approval of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Zachary wrote, "I argue Mr. Chin is being slightly naive and horribly optimistic. As for the optimism, let's be honest. President Obama has dug himself numerous holes. His most important legislative accomplishment, Obamacare, is crashing down. Every day, a new story comes out about a lie, a deceit, or unconstitutional action his administration committed. And if a majority Democrat Congress could not authorize giving the president those TPP enacting powers, there's no chance the new majority Republicans will." Now, Zachary brings up a very good point, but I would like to add that NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was signed under President Bill Clinton and a Democratic Congress, was actually started as a Republican effort under the first President Bush. And Lynn Gregg tweeted to me saying that she enjoyed my Angkor Wat video, and that's something I'd actually really like to thank her for. As I mentioned a few podcasts ago when Angkor Wat was listed as the 2014 Archaeological Site of the Year, I truly enjoyed being there. 4 days weren't enough, and out of all the archaeological sites I've been to in recent history, that's one place I'd definitely like to return to. I'd like to thank everyone who took the time to leave a comment last week. I truly do value them, and I hope you'll take a moment to share your thoughts about this week's stories and do so in the comments on Facebook or Twitter. Now, if you haven't found us on social media, just go to Facebook. You can look for Asian News Weekly. You'll find our Facebook page there, or go to Twitter and look for @Asian News Weekly. Throughout the week, I post additional stories that you may find interesting. You can also send an email to the show with your questions or feedback or with your comments. Just drop a line to podcast@asiannewsweekly.net. If you go to our website, you can play every single show, but if you prefer the show in podcast form, look for us on iTunes, Stitcher, and TuneIn Radio. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. To learn more about the stories I mentioned in this week's podcast, be sure to visit our site and look for the show notes. Thank you again for listening. I really do appreciate it. And until next time, for Asian News Weekly, I'm Steve Miller. Asian News Weekly is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License.